Okay, welcome to everybody. I'm the managing partner of tranScrip, and I have some panelists with me who are going to talk about a very interesting subject, which is how we've been coping with communications during COVID-19, which has presented one or two challenges. We've still got quite a lot of people joining, so that's why we stalled a little bit, and I will stall for another minute or so before we get started properly. For those of you who don't know, tranScrip is a specialist service consultancy. We have a lot of drug development people, medical affairs people, and we do a lot of communicating, not just with helping our clients to communicate with healthcare professionals, sometimes patients and other things, but also obviously with our clients as well. So the way of which we have been communicating in the last few months has been really very different from what we are generally used to. So I think that some of the things that have been happening, and when we had a discussion yesterday, they've been happening already, things like virtual ad boards and some digital support for MSLs. But some things, like we are not used to having no conferences for months on end, and that has been very, very different for us to adapt to. And it's not just discussing things with healthcare professionals, but you know, all the service industries that support the pharma infrastructure also use those conferences and so on for communicating with people. So there's been a lot of change. So we have with us today people who represent big pharma and medium-sized pharma, emerging pharma, if I can call it that, Niels, and I will bring you in shortly. And also one of my colleagues, Ed Currie, who is actually working with much smaller pharmas. And so I'm going to get them to introduce themselves in a minute, but we are representing globally, I think, Japan, China, in terms of ownership of companies, and the US, and also the UK, and of course we're headquartered in the UK as well. The one other person you need to know is Don Bowers, who is actually going to be interpreting any audience questions that come in and making sure that, if possible, that we address them without redirecting the flow of the conversation too much. So it should be a very interesting next hour of discussions, but I have to give you some housekeeping rules. The discussion on this panel is being recorded, so be aware that anything you say might reappear on the website if people so choose to push the appropriate buttons. And also that people who are on this call, they are presenting their own opinions, and I think they are all very mindful of confidentiality issues. We all work for pharma, and we have clients, and we are very mindful of the confidentiality of those discussions. So we may not always be able to answer your questions. All the attendees are muted, but you have a question panel, you can ask questions, and we will do our very best to answer them. And the intention of the panel discussion is really to share some of our experiences of trying to work in this world, and some of them, I think, have brought extremely positive reflections on how pharma might change in the future, and some have been a little bit more challenging. But before we start, we thought we'd run a poll question, and I see we've got quite a substantial number of people online now. So shall we go to the poll question next, Ashton? So this is just a question to you. what has COVID-19 and lockdown done to your healthcare professional interactions? Have they been much less effective, about the same as before, more effective, or much more effective? We thought that would be interesting for people to say. So please go ahead and vote now, and then Ashton, you'll give us the results, I hope. So once we've got those, we can go back to the panelists. Do we have the results? So that is quite interesting. They've been about the same as before or less effective, and the numbers that were much less and much more are slightly smaller. So an interesting result. We'll go on to see what our panelists have to say. So my next task is to introduce the panelists. So Niels, would you like to go first and give us your background, and we'll and just a little bit about some of the things that you've been facing.
Thank you, Flic. My name is Nils Eckardt. I started my career as a physician many decades ago at the University Hospital Hamburg-Eppendorf in hematology oncology. I've worked as a management consultant for the life science industry, and I've been in the industry for about 20 years now, I think. I have started in large pharma with Roche at the time. That's how I got into Switzerland. I've worked for smaller pharma like Ariad and Tesaro, and now, according to Flic, I work for emerging pharma at BeiGene. Now, I must admit I have never put this term emerging pharma to BeiGene. I'm the VP Medical Affairs responsible for Europe, and I'm the site head of our European headquarters site. BeiGene, you're forgiven for not knowing who that is, as we're emerging. We're a 10-year-old company now, focused on oncology, founded in China, but we see ourselves as a global biopharmaceutical company. And in my area, medical affairs, I have spent my time at BeiGene starting to build the European medical affairs team. That includes country medical directors, that includes also an MSL team. So my team and I, we were very much impacted by COVID-19. As the team I put together a year and a bit ago was selected for their ability to be outgoing, to be in the field, and that ability was probably not needed in a situation of a lockdown. I was surprised by the poll that just came up. I would have gone for more efficient, but maybe we'll wait for the discussion to look into that further.
Excellent. So let's move on to Louise next to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Flic. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are based. So my name is Louise Sheppard, and I am currently working for Astellas Pharma. I started many moons ago. I think I did work this out yesterday. It was about 25 years ago I started in pharma. I in fact started in medical education agencies. I worked for a couple of agencies based out of the UK for around 6 or 7 years, and then I moved into pharma itself. I moved to work for DuPont Pharma, who was then subsequently bought by Bristol Myers Squibb, clearly big pharma being BMS. Worked in HIV, worked in hepatitis C. When I first moved into pharma, I worked in the marketing side, so I was a marketing manager for Europe. And then after about 5 years or so, I moved over to medical affairs, partly because the work I was doing at that time within marketing was actually more of a medical affairs function. And as the industry evolved, it became more sensible that I would move across to medical affairs. And I've been there pretty much ever since, and it's my place to be, I have to say. I moved into communications first of all, and then I moved into medical strategy, always within the European arena. Then about 6-7 years ago, I set up my own consultancy, and I worked for a number of different organizations then, from startups through to generics company. I worked for a couple of years, and then I did some consulting work for Astellas, and finally moved into Astellas as an employee during the course of last year. So I'm working in medical excellence and medical communications, part of the medical operations team. And really what my work does looks at the external engagement. So that's from the MSL functional aspects, but also medical information as well. And the areas I'm covering are Europe, Australia, and Canada. So I'm going to question the poll. So I think it all depends on your interpretation. So effectiveness, what is effectiveness? Is that a quantitative or a qualitative measure? And I think it's your assumptions going in will dictate how you interpret what comes out. So I think it's an interesting discussion point, but there you go.
Okay, Bill.
Thank you. And good afternoon, good evening. I come from a background of pharmacy, had a PharmD, did a residency in oncology. I've been working primarily at larger pharmaceutical companies, SmithKline, which became GlaxoSmithKline, as an MSL, and then later as an MSL director, across a number of different therapeutic areas. I also did a little work with medical information at that time, then moved over to BMS, their virology, and then later their oncology teams. And then more recently, for the past 12 years, I was at AstraZeneca. I had a number of roles there, one of which included building out their virtual MSL team. But I ran some of their strategy and oncology area, the medical information in the US, and then finally built out and led their global medical excellence team before leaving for Allergan, where I led the US MSL team across all therapeutic areas. And as you probably have seen, Allergan has just been integrated into AbbVie, and as such, they have a different model. So I'm transitioning into a different role, but certainly can speak a lot about the differences and the approaches, because Allergan and AbbVie took a very similar approach to what we've had to go through for with the COVID situation. And I would say I'm not too surprised by the poll, because I think it's caused an abrupt change, and I think it's something to talk about. And there's always good and bad when you have change. It's a disruptor, and I'm anxious to discuss today about how this will affect things moving forward, because I think there's a lot of positives to come out of it. But anytime you're dealing with change, it's going to cause some stress and some unknown and adaptation, not only from the industry, but also from healthcare providers.
So, Ed, last but not least, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Flic, and good morning, good afternoon to all attendees. I'm Ed Currie. I'm head of medical affairs and virtual offerings, and also deputy head of the oncology team at tranScrip. I'm a pharmaceutical physician with about more than 30 years industry experience. Trained in medicine in London at St Thomas's Hospital, where Boris Johnson was recently a patient. But I've spent more than 25 years in Switzerland, mainly in Basel. I joined pharma industry after hospital jobs and specialization, first with Eli Lilly in clinical research internationally, and then moved to Roche in Basel, where I was medical director and head of medical marketing for the global oncology virology business unit. I also at Roche was then global business leader for MabThera, rituximab in lymphoma, also head of disease management, and towards the end also actually acting head of e-marketing. I also spent about 5 years in venture-backed biotech and diagnostic companies, and also pharmaceutical consulting in both large companies, IBM, Infosys, Lodestone, and now a smaller one at tranScrip, where I work across the life cycle, especially in oncology and infectious disease, especially in medical affairs, and now increasingly in digital. Thanks.
Good. So, and Ed looks after our clients in medical affairs and digital, and chairs our digital working team. So now, yesterday when we got together to decide what we were going to discuss in this session, we looked at some of the things that really were reinforcing what we were doing already, and some of the things that were going to really change us to a new normal. And I think perhaps we could start with communicating with healthcare professionals in how that has changed and whether that will go back to normal, and whether it has really changed or it's just reinforced the rate of change. So maybe, Bill, we could start with you talking about, do you think that this has changed things?
Absolutely, it's changed things. I think in time will tell how permanent and how we adapt. I do think it'll change, even moving forward, there'll be a permanent change. And some of it, and quite frankly, I think it's good in that, you know, healthcare providers in the past and even senior executives at companies were reluctant to really embrace some of the virtual capabilities, which I think has a role in how we communicate. I mean, it makes us more efficient, gets a broader ability to get the information and have discussions much broader because of the lack of travel and just all that comes with showing up for an appointment face to face. I think face to face still has a very important role. We are human beings, and we tend to like the connections and build relationships up, and those are very important. But it's always been a very expensive, very precious sort of commodity, if you will, to have those in a limited amount, to have scientists go around having face-to-face discussions. So I think it's forced us to rethink how we approach things and embrace the technology, try different technology. I know in our company, it really opened up the ability to try different things within our IT division, our IT departments, along with support from senior executives, whereas in the past, they may be very cautious about trying new technologies. But I think even more important is I've seen the willingness, reluctantly at first for some, but I think they're getting there more and more, is from the HCPs, because it has to be two ways. And they're now, I think, getting much more comfortable with the technology. And I think because of that, they're going to start to demand that that's the way it should go. I mean, they're starting to even, I know in the US, embrace much more of the telemedicine and the like. So I think in that respect, it's not going to go back to the way it was. I think it's going to be some sort of hybrid of what we're dealing with now.
Myself off mute. Niels, you talked about how yesterday about how the confidence of the MSLs and so on had to be built and changed, but once they espoused it, it really has probably been better than before. Is that a fair comment about what you said yesterday with regard to the face-to-face with individuals, with healthcare professionals?
I think it is. The team that we put together in a situation to launch, to introduce a company, to prepare for our clinical data to be presented, and to eventually lead the company into a pre-launch and launch situation. We have chosen people very talented to build up relationships. We have chosen who also came, in our case right now, with specific relationships to healthcare providers in the hemato-oncology space. Now, with the lockdown, that particular talent was no longer in the center of what we had to do. And as expected, the number of touch points in the first 6 to 8 weeks of the lockdown went down. But then we also saw that as of month 3, numbers were increasing again. And what in particularly became visible is that where before we had interactions that were 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes in many cases, interactions in general became half an hour or an hour or even longer. And the quality, the depth of the interaction has improved very much. So in line with what Louise earlier challenged on the poll, it's a question how you judge on efficiency. For me, the quality is clearly a key driver of efficiency here. Our goal is not just to have a friendly chat and a cup of coffee. Our goal is to introduce the company and to introduce our pipeline and our new products to come. And therefore, for me, efficiency has increased, even if the number of touch points that we would have today without COVID-19 and the lockdown clearly would have been larger than what the team is doing today.
Yes, very, very interesting. So we're picking up things that management have, or senior management members have to espouse this, which they didn't have to before. And Niels, you're telling us that we probably have to have different people with slightly different skill sets potentially. And I'm going to pick you up on that last comment, which was about the efficiency, and bring Louise in, because I think yesterday you said that sometimes it was more difficult to get appointments with HCPs, but when you did get them, it was better organized. And maybe you can talk about how that getting the appointments and getting the connections has changed.
Yeah, so that example yesterday, that was more for our sales teams rather than our medical affairs teams. For our medical affairs teams, we've very much been driven by the institutions, by the national bodies in terms of what they have said, in terms of interactions, whether they're permissible or not. I think there was, at the beginning, it was very much, you know, the whole VUCA experience that everybody's in, but once that started to calm down, then people were actually very interested in having meetings again. But we have to also be, as we're reaching out, we have to make sure that we're being very empathetic to what people have been going through, or with their colleagues, etc. So I think as Pharma, we have to make sure that we are making that outreach in the appropriate way, that we are expressing that we are there for people if they want to make that contact with us. And of course, medical affairs, we are more of a reactive rather than a proactive organization anyway. Yes. So I think to the comment about MSLs and the skills that you need to be an MSL, you need to have that scientific gravitas, you need to have that knowledge, but you need to be that excellent communicator as well. Good MSLs are extremely difficult to find, and then when you get them, you need to hold on to them. And I think we've added this additional idea now with the whole digital virtual interaction. It's something on top of that. And for me, the challenge is we need to find advocates within our teams who really buy into that, who really want to advance that way of communicating, because our MSL teams are also a mixed bunch of people with different knowledge, different skill sets, different wants. So as we build externally advocates, we also want to build internally in terms of that communication. So that's one way that we've been working. Find somebody where it's worked well, and to Nils's point about increasing confidence, find people who have tried it, where it's worked, and then get them to share that best practice within their country, but also across the regions as well.
Yes, that's interesting about the the training. And Ed, you've been involved in adapting materials from planning to go forward in our normal way of writing materials to providing materials that can be delivered digitally, and also supporting the MSLs with that sort of material. Has that had to change?
Yes, I think it's really been an evolution, and I think we've been learning and growing together with our clients. So for a variety of clients, we've been involved in activities in the first half of this year, which started as face-to-face planned activities. So there were either virtual, let's say, advisory boards that became virtual. We do a lot of those, but obviously those have become virtual. Satellite symposia, training, and a variety of other activities which would have been perhaps having some element of virtual anyway, but have now become very much virtual, at least for the foreseeable future. And when I say it's an evolution, I think what we've seen is that we've seen activities that were planned face-to-face, and then suddenly you've had COVID thrown at you, and it's been a matter of, whoa, hang on, how do we still keep the timelines, especially if there's a stake in the ground, let's say, around the conference, for example. To hit the timelines, how do you actually do that? And so a lot of it has been, let's taking materials and reformatting them and presenting them better. I think what we're already seeing is the next step is making those materials particularly interesting and attractive among all the noise of other offerings and other companies and other symposia and other advertising that's out there, and give people reasons to go there and also to stay there. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Louise.
Louise.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that you just triggered something in my mind. So I think it's about the content and what you're delivering, but it's also about that conversation. And a virtual conversation is very different to a face-to-face conversation. And I think you need to speak with your team as they're having that interaction. Do they need to phrase a question differently? Do they need to present more of the why, really asking the why a lot more? We have seen some research that's been done by STEM Healthcare, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, where in a virtual interaction, people are more using the what. So they're not probing, they're not doing the why. Why do you do that? To really understand. So I think it's a different skill set, because you're asking people to do something in a way that they're not used to doing. So perhaps they go a little bit more back in terms of how they're grasping and making that conversation. So I think it's the content, but I think the delivery and the conversation style also needs to adapt in that environment.
So that sounds like we need a new, quite different kind of training. I mean, sharing and training, but we need, and that goes back to Niels's point about how, you know, you recruited for one skill and then find that they need something rather different. Bill, you're looking like you would like to contribute here.
No, I was just going to add, we spent a lot of time at the beginning to help with the transition on training, as the confusion of what was going on as folks were told to stay at home and were struggling to figure out what to do to get their confidence. We spent a lot of time training. And I think one of the aspects, it's the same, I guess, skill set, but you emphasize different things in that skill set when you're on video. And I think trying to keep people engaged is a little bit, can be a little bit harder. And that's where we try to emphasize it, is coming up with ways to make it more engaging, more pleasant. Otherwise, you know, people will just, I mean, we've all been on the conference calls where you just kind of tune people out. So that's where I think the skill sets become very heightened, is to not just to lecture. You shouldn't do that anyway live, but it's even more important when you're doing it on a video conference.
Yeah, it's the Zoom fatigue, yes. Exactly. Which somehow is different from watching something on television. It just you know. And I often, I mean, we have a few presenters on BBC television who keep popping up at pharma conferences to do the interviewing, you know, and they're very dynamic, and you think this is really great, but it's not a skill that you could watch for any length of time, really. And I think, so in summary, you know, all the skills are the same. We're reinforcing it. It sounds like we're learning better skills, and that actually it's going to improve communication a great deal. But we're also going to have to change the behaviors of the healthcare professionals themselves to be able to understand that kind of interaction. I would like to change tack slightly, because I don't want to run out of time to talk about the enormous amount of money that pharma would normally spend on conferences and communicating not just with the healthcare professionals we're prescribing to, but also to each other, doing business development, all the things that we would normally go to conferences for. And most of that has gone. Now, I'd like to bring in you, Niels, because you've had a very successful virtual booth, and I think that hasn't always reflected the experiences that other people have had at the online conferences. And so maybe you could talk to us about your virtual booth, which I think has been very successful, hasn't it? I think you're on mute.
Thank you. I think we found ourselves in the very situation that Ed has described. We learned relatively short notice that our conferences were turning into virtual events. That was true for ASCO in the US, but it was also true for the EHA meeting, the meeting of the European Hematology Association, which is a very important meeting for us here in Europe. Being the European team, we were responsible to create that meeting as a success within BeiGene. Now, EHA has allowed us and helped us on the way to invent something new. EHA decided that they would split the conference in a scientific and an exhibition platform, and gave us the opportunity to build our own medical information booth. As such, they allowed us, and this is what we did, to create a booth that we can keep open long term, and during the conference have connected to the EHA platform. It is a process. I think we're very happy with what we have achieved. We're even more happy with what we have learned up to now. And we have in particular learned a lot of ways to improve what we've done so far. Many of the things that we felt, because we had a bit of a tunnel vision, would be nice and work well, may not have been seen like that by the healthcare professional visiting us. At the same time, yesterday we were talking a bit about numbers. I think the numbers show that we have been successful. It looks like we've had more than 1,000 healthcare professionals visiting our booth so far, either coming directly from the conference or coming through the publicity that we have made to announce that we're doing this, that we are available online, that we are happy to show ourselves online, and also that we offer this as a platform to come into contact and start the interaction with people we don't know yet.
No, that's very interesting. And our first virtual booth was about 3 years ago with one of the big pharmas, and it worked actually quite well, but actually most people enjoyed it simply because it was different. I think because at the time there weren't very many virtual booths around, And the marketing support to make it successful is a really key thing, I think, and the way in which that marketing is done at the right time. And I don't know, Louise, you had a bit of a different experience with some of the conferences, and I think some of us have had quite a checkered experience with different conferences. Sometimes the software's been good, sometimes not. And you are dependent, aren't you, on what the conference organizers put up as online software that you can build on.
Yes, very much so. So I think we're still at the early days of understanding whether what has been done at the virtual congress is successful or not. So we've done a number of symposia through the congress organizers, which seem to have been very well accepted. For the booths, it's a bit more of a question. So we're obviously, for medical affairs, we're just looking at the medical booth, which is always a small subset of the larger booth. And we had one that was done in Australia, which went very well. That was right back at the early days. 2 months ago, it seems early days, but everything goes fast. Yes. And we're waiting still to hear back from the current meetings that we've been at more recently, both in nephrology but also in oncology and hematology as well. But yes, you are very much at the behest of the organizers, and whether that's a global meeting, a national meeting, a European meeting, the more national meetings, there's clearly budgets are a little bit more tight. So what does that have implications? Yeah, so we're still in the early days.
Yes,
I think one of the big positives is that when you have your symposium, the materials are available for a duration. They're not just one shot. It was that 2-hour session. It's more enduring materials. And I think that's what's going to be interesting to track over time as well.
Yes, the endurance and the repeat visits once that material is somewhere on the web. Bill, what about you? What have you experienced with the various different conference functions?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are still, quite frankly, scrambling to figure out how to be effective in this environment. I think some things are done better virtually. The sharing of information, quite frankly, could be done. I always thought could be done ahead of time anyway. Like here's the information, here's the new trial and all that. It's the interaction that suffers, I think, when to some degree, especially the one-on-ones, the meet somebody in the hall over lunch, dinner type of thing. Those things are hard to replace virtually, and even though there is good technology out there, it's just not quite the same. I think, and also to find things electronically sometimes is very difficult. You have to search much more, whereas you walk in a hall, you kind of stumble upon things, if you will. So I think everyone is trying to grasp how much investment, what's the right investment, what's the right technology to go to, while it looks like this may be affected far longer than we even thought, at least through the end of the year, if not into next year, if not longer. So as I think it's still very much evolving, and at least from my point of view, I don't think I've seen it done well in spots, but I don't think the overall strategy is still, people are still trying to come to grasp with.
Ed, we've had very mixed experience with the booths. I mean, in some really excellent, and some have been much more challenging. To some extent, the software. Obviously, our first booths with way back 2 or 3 years ago, were all about sort of rare disease in remote locations. So it was a very different kind of arrangement. And sometimes those booths have been used to be melded. I know Indogene, our alliance partner, does some things where they meld booths with information campuses and very sophisticated things like that. But what's your experience with some of our other clients, and also possibly some of our experience with conferences?
Yeah, well, I'll take your second point first. So our own experience, of course, tranScrip as a service company, we go to a lot of conferences, and they're very important for us, like they are for Pharma, for meeting our clients, which are folks like yourselves. So having no physical interaction capabilities has been a challenge, and it's been interesting to see the evolution of the congresses, because we have an extensive calendar of meetings that we attend throughout the year across the different therapeutic areas, and some of the early ones just cancelled. So the clients of ours who were planning to be there didn't even get the chance to decide face-to-face or virtually. It was just cancelled. Some were postponed and then cancelled. And then I think we saw ASCO was one of the early ones that they cancelled and went virtual quite early. But I must say, it was we put up a booth there, and it was more just a placeholder, just a quick one. We didn't have time to do extensive preparatory marketing and interlinking with all the other things that are needed, I think. And we had a little bit of virtual footfall, but to be honest, it was really not driving our business much. The ASCO ones were very difficult to find, I think, for everyone. It was a website very buried, and if you were buried anyway within the buried website, it was almost impossible to find. You wouldn't stumble across it like you walk into an exhibition hall at the meeting and see what's around, and walk up and down the aisles, or go somewhere. It was quite difficult to locate. I thought the EHA one was much nicer. They took longer to make their mind up. I think when they did it, they actually came up with a good, a very nice model. And I think some of our clients, as I said, some of them didn't have the option. The meeting was cancelled. Others, it went virtual, but they decided not to have a presence there. Others went for the Congress offering booth. But I think, Niels, what you were mentioning about having a standalone booth that runs independently of the conference, but which can be linked, I think that gives a lot more possibilities to do things and to develop it more into, like what you were talking about, multi-purpose places to meet, which could be with your customers, could also be internally. You can have rooms, meeting rooms, like at a conference, but you don't have to necessarily have them only for meetings at conferences. They could be a place to meet with your experts, your advisors, or just for KOL interactions, or internally as well. You can have a meeting which is, has a virtual padlock on it, which is only for internal meetings, so a post-conference debrief or just a team meeting. So I think we're going to see the development more and more of sort of hybrid models that don't necessarily need to be tethered to a particular event. So
yes, I think
you've seen a lot of different ones.
I think that's a very good point. And I think one of the audience questions now is, do we see that the balance of interactions with healthcare professionals, with learning materials, with conferences and so on, is going to change in the future, so that when we plan our comms programs and what we do with MSLs and with the sales force, is that going to have a different balance in the future? Are we going to have to go back as we come through peri-registration and earlier in planning what we're going to say and how we're going to say it, where and to whom? Are we going to have to rethink all those kind of things? I mean, for me, I think that's quite challenging. I don't know, Louise, what do you think?
I think it's definitely, well, yeah, I think it's definitely going to change. In what way? I don't know. Don't have a crystal ball, obviously. I think we've got another tool. So the hand has been forced. We've got another tool, and we need to work out. We've shown that things can be done. Now we have to work out, do we actually want to do them that way? And then it's not just us making that decision, it's also understanding our physicians that we're interacting with. How do they want to interact with us? So we need to have that discussion with them, and we need to understand what their needs are, because it is going to be some people will only ever want to do face-to-face interactions. They will travel regardless. They want their MSL to come see them, etc. And others will be completely the other way. They see the efficiency. They can have a 20-minute meeting or a 30-minute meeting with an MSL. They can download the slides from the symposium at the Congress. They don't need to move anymore. So, and then in the middle, you've got that whole range of some people will want some people will want something else. So I think the onus is on us to understand the needs and to provide. I mean, it's the classic multi-channel approach, isn't it, where you put your HCP or your patient or whoever right at the center of that. And then we have to understand, how do we make that interaction? But certainly things are changing, and it's that push pull. Do people want to have more self-directed learning rather than to move themselves and go to a congress? They want to just pull it down at the time that they want to have that information. So, yeah, yes. It's understanding all of that.
Yeah, interesting. Niels, what do you think? Do you think it's going to change the balance? I think it already has, for to some extent.
I think as much as our hand has been forced, also the healthcare professional, our partners are being forced. And as much as we were in lockdown, they were in lockdown. And the rules are changing. In Europe, the rules are different from country to country. The access that we as pharma have to hospitals, to healthcare centers, is changing. It has changed for good reason during COVID. In many places, we're still in a COVID situation, or at least a post-COVID situation, where restrictions are in place. Moving forwards, also the centers of care have made their learnings, and they are in processes to move their jobs into a remote environment. So in some countries, doctors are being told that in future they should treat half of their patients remotely, however that may be possible. And we are one partner. Also, the relation to us will be challenged in the same way, and physicians are being told to not receive us in the hospital, and that forces their hand in the same direction. Do we have to rethink everything? I don't think so. There are certain principles, and these principles are a bit of a gold standard and will remain. We need to know what we want to say, and it was already expressed earlier. Our exchange, especially on the medical affairs side, has to create value for our counterpart. These are the golden rules, and I don't think they will ever change. If we don't provide value, people have no need to talk to us. If we don't have something to say, why should someone spend the time on talking to us? Yeah. So I think those are the golden rules that will not change. I think what has happened here in the past, it was a lot easier to get away with a little less quality and a little less to say, and that's taken away from us. Yeah. So we have to become better me's, better us to face this new challenge.
Yes, I think that is a very good point. Bill, do you want to contribute to it? Do you think that it's going to change the balance between how we provide information?
Yeah, yes, I do. I think it was always going to change. I think this is, yeah, eventually. I think this has sped it up, you know, and create an environment to speed up. What I don't know is exactly how what that balance will look like and how it'll come about, because I think we're right now in the space of folks are innovating and trial and error, and I think some things will work, some things won't. But as with most things, people adjust, and I think what we have to do is do what we're doing here, be open to discussions, be open to learning, find out what's happening, see what works, what doesn't, get feedback from the healthcare providers as well of what works, and it'll evolve. I think what this situation with COVID has done is sped up that process and created that environment for innovation to be necessary. And I think because we don't know all the answers, it creates anxiety, and it creates you know, folks being a little bit like I said, anxious about it. But I think it definitely will change, and it already is changing. It's just the question of exactly where it's headed. We don't know.
Yeah.
It's not.
Louise.
Sorry. Yeah, so I think there's two parts to it as well. So the congresses are about education. They are a medical education activity. When we talk about the MSLs and the external engagement, that's very much a two-way interaction. So it is about providing the fair, balanced information, but it's also about getting those insights from the outside in. And I think that's why we have to look at those two slightly differently, because that is it's an exchange of information, and they are our eyes and ears on the ground out there. And I think that's why there will always be the place for face-to-face, but virtual engagement is an additional tool, as I said previously.
Yeah. Yes, I think Ed, that we would see in the organisation that actually one of the huge values of conferences that we're not sure we're going to be able to replace is the incoming information, as well as our education of what we do. But in a conference, we interact with a lot of people that we wouldn't dream of making contact with, and that has huge value, doesn't it? And I think we are wondering how we're going to replace that in terms of our customers and clients, as well as for our customers and clients, because really learning things from journals or trying to get on as many webinars as you can doesn't really replace walking around, hearing from people what interesting things are happening. And that, I think, is probably the biggest challenge for us. Would you agree, Ed?
Absolutely, and I think some of the meetings we go to are the medical conferences. We also go to partnering meetings, which of course Pharma does as well, but particularly to meet biotech companies to acquire assets, business development, and partnerships. So that sort of model, again, you can do part of that just in a transactional way. So we one of the Bio Europe meetings that we normally attend, we did the virtual equivalent, and you can have virtual partnering meetings which are probably quite similar in many respects to the face-to-face thing, but it's all the surrounding events. It's the the conference you would be meeting, you'd be having dinners, you'd be having dinner meetings and chats and coffee meetings with your HCPs, and likewise there are social events, there's networking events at some of the partnering meetings, and that's completely gone. So you really can't reproduce that, somewhere with music, some local brand of food and drink and whatever. But you meet an awful lot of people there from, as you say, a wide range of areas, and that's very it's very stimulating and makes a lot of connections. That has certainly, I think, is going to be difficult to replace without face-to-face.
Yes, no, I very much agree, and I've just come off a session with the Academy of Medical Sciences, where we were doing an induction for new members and so on. It's very difficult to meet all these new people virtually because it's just a real challenge. And therefore I think those things are a real challenge to expand. And the other thing is that quite a lot of our conferences that we're involved with, we do a lot of work in things like CF, where the patients turn up as well. So it's not just communication with healthcare professionals, it's also getting out the messaging around the support that we can give to the patients. And I think that's true of quite a lot of the oncology conferences as well, that you are pulling together information that is very much patient orientated. And I know that, and I know we're coming up to time now, and we're going to run the poll in a minute, and thank you very much for your input. But I'd leave one last thought. We've got new code and FPA code and ABPI code and so on shortly coming out. And I'm sure in the US as well, we're going to get new guidance around communications for the digital side of things and so on. And I think this is going to be, it is, as Louise, I think you used the word empathy, and Ed, you used the word evolution. We are going to have to go through a learning period. And that period, as the other thing that you said, Louise, is that it's at the beginning of all this, which was early days, 2 months ago, time seems to have speeded up during the COVID session, and that has made life quite challenging. So I think, unfortunately, we're coming up to time. I would like to just have a few minutes to run the second poll that Ed suggested, which I think will be quite interesting. And if we can put that up. And in the meantime, while that's going up, I would like to thank all our panelists. It's been really interesting. So the final question is, in future, how much of your HCP interactions do you expect you will be doing virtually compared with pre-COVID? Much more, the same, less, or much less? And we'll give you a minute to look at those and potentially go back to. So do we have some results? You see the results? Much more. So I think that is the answer, but I would like to finish with the fact that actually face-to-face does still have its place, absolutely. And I think that I was on a webinar recently where we were discussing virtual clinical trials and interactions with physicians as a patient. And one of the patients said, I just value being touched, you know, even if it's just somebody putting a hand on my knee to say, is it still painful? You know, there is something about face-to-face that is really important. So I think I'll wind up by saying that I think it's been a really interesting discussion. I suspect there's a lot more to go in discussions over the next few months, but I think our biggest challenge probably is incoming information, extending our networks and so on, because that is really difficult to do face to face. It can be done, but it's really quite laborious at the moment. So thank you all very much indeed. Look forward to some more discussions, and I hope for the audience, thank you for staying to the bitter end and for giving us some questions. And we will be having another one probably in another 2 to 3 weeks, and I hope you will join. And we'll be sending out some information, and this one will be available on the web as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this.
Yes.
It was a pleasure.
Many thanks all for joining.